Good morning. This is Tuesday, August the 28th. This is The Drill. Good morning. Thank you, and welcome to The Drill. I'm Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States of America, because I'm the only one that makes the presumption for the status quo. An example is free trade. Free trade is not a conservative idea, although there's a lot of conservatives that like to pretend that it is. Free trade is also, and free trade is not a conservative idea because free trade is idealistic. The only way we'll ever have free trade in the world is if we have one world government. One world government is of the left. The left is looking for that. Left is looking for socialist paradise in which you have one world government and eventually anarchy, where you have no government at all and people will just trade amongst each other freely. So there's no evidence that any of that is going to be happening. We have never had free trade, and we don't now, and it doesn't look like we're going to have anything like that in the future because we have countries. Every country has its own interests, its own citizens, and the governments of those countries are to look out for the interests of their own citizens. So absent one world government, there's not going to be any free trade. So the idea that this is some kind of conservative value is simply nonsense. Libertarians like it because, again, it's idealistic. I'm sure socialists subscribe to it, again, because it's idealistic. It's a utopian kind of a situation. What there is that there is tariffs of various sorts between different countries, and the best you can hope for is to try to achieve some kind of balance, some kind of agreement in terms of tariffs and whatnot between countries that is going to be as close to beneficial for both sides, not perfectly beneficial, then as close to that as you can get. And that is more of a realistic scenario, and it's a realistic way of looking at world trade than free trade, which is idealistic and therefore of the left. And when I come back, it's going to be I'm going to read from the book by Tammy Bruce called The Death of Right and Wrong. Yeah, thank you very much. And The Death of Right and Wrong by Tammy Bruce. She's not only an author, but a radio talk show host and former lefty, become conservative, or at least ersatz conservative, and but well worth listening to, well worth reading her books, because she has a lot of insight about what the left is truly all about. So we're in this section in her book where she had been talking about the cultural effects and how it is that the countercultural efforts of the left have influenced the country so that we have less. One of the ways they do it is killing outrage, and by killing outrage, they can also then eventually after that get people to quit thinking in terms and acting in terms of right and wrong. The one place where she misses is you have to have a replacement for that. You can't leave a vacuum. Otherwise, the vacuum is likely to be filled with whatever it is that you're trying to get rid of. So in this particular case, with the vacuum they're filling with is power, trying to convince people that life is nothing but a series of struggles, that it's all about power. The person that has the person or persons that have the power are the ones that are going to be able to, of course, that the people with the power are the only ones that matter, and that having power is the only thing that matters. Incorrect, of course, because it is right and wrong that matters. It is might that it should be subordinated to right. It isn't always, but it should be. So That's where we are with the book, and this section of the chapter is called "It's All Relative." The impact these factors can have on personal decision-making is clearly illustrated by a recent Washington Post magazine cover story, which proclaims, in the eyes of his parents, if Galvin Hughes McCullough turns out to be deaf, that will be just perfect. The story is astonishingly tragic. A deaf lesbian couple, Sharon and Candy, both mental health therapists, of all people, deliberately sought a deaf sperm donor in hopes that their child would be born deaf like them. And they explained to the Post reporter, it would be nice to have a deaf child who's the same as us. I think that would be a wonderful experience. You know, if we can have that chance, why not take it? And the first thing that comes to my mind, the word that pops into my mind is selfish. And it's noteworthy because the left is always about, don't be selfish. The idea that capitalism is supposed to be very selfish, and the people that are capitalistic are supposed to be selfish, and the people of the left are the ones that are supposed to be thinking about everybody else. But in this case, the couple is obviously only thinking about themselves, not thinking about the well-being of the child, nor thinking about the well-being of society. Back to the story. The reporter, Lisa Monday, spun it this way. Sharon and Candy are a little like immigrant parents with a huge and dominant and somewhat alien culture just outside their door. Immigrant parents, alien culture, not quite, but it all sounds so familiar, doesn't it? It's an isolation, an otherness that the left wants its constituencies to feel, and the rest of us to accept. The left's success in classifying groups into their own little culture, alone and unto their own private special world, obscures personal responsibility. It serves to pound into you the falsehood that you cannot know what that way of life, and so you mustn't judge it. In these enforced cultural ghettos, none of us are deemed capable of understanding anyone else, making all decisions and all behaviors morally relative and beyond judgment. I remember that when I was going to school, junior high school and whatnot, I used to hear that all the time. Because again, you got to remember, all of these cultural trends didn't happen overnight. This stuff with the deaf couple here, this trend didn't happen overnight. It wasn't yesterday. This is something that's been brewing for decades. And it started when I was in school. You used to hear people say, if you confronted them about something, you don't know me. You don't know what I'm thinking. You don't know what I'm feeling. You don't know who I am. And that dovetails with what she's saying here is, I don't know you, therefore I cannot judge your behavior. BS. If you're stealing from me, it doesn't matter who you are. Theft is theft. And I can judge you and judge your behavior. Back to the book. Until fairly recently, no one would have thought of describing deafness as a culture. It's a disability that condemns the afflicted to a world of silence, without words, without music, without, a great deal of the time, speech. It is undeniably a different world, but is it an alien culture? I think not. No more than being blind or diabetic is a culture. Is there anything wrong with having a disability? Of course not. Most people with disabilities are able to lead fulfilling lives. I'm going to stop right there and interject. Here's where the right goes wrong. Is there anything wrong with having a disability? Yes! That's why it's called a disability. That's why we don't value disabilities. If we valued disabilities, then what we would do is we wouldn't wait for a deaf child and hope that a child would be born deaf in this particular case. We would simply give birth to a healthy child and then make them deaf. Okay, maybe through surgical means or through other means, make them deaf, make them blind, break their legs, paralyze them. Disabilities are not values. They are not things we value. They are anti-values. Okay, so yes, there's something wrong with being disabled. You're also a small percentage of the population, and it's just not normal. It's not normal. You're not living to your fullest. It's an impediment to seeking happiness, which is what we are all looking for. So yes, there is something wrong with it. But that's where the right goes off the rails here is because they want to appear sensitive. It's got nothing to do with sensitivity. The fact of the matter is, disabilities are an anti-value. We do not value disabilities. If we did, then we would cripple all of our children. Okay, so back to the book. Let's see. But what about deliberately inflicting a disability on someone else? The answer to Sharon and Candy's question, if we can have that chance, why not take it, is because they're wrong. That's why not. So she gets back on track here and praise to her for using the W word. Right? Using the word wrong. So many people want to avoid that. They will talk in a way as to avoid right and wrong. They will go from in an issue or a situation where ethics is called for, making an ethical judgment. They will instead make a metaphysical description. That's what they substitute. Descriptions for judgments and values. But Tammy Bruce goes ahead and uses the W word. Good for you. Next section. But they're stylish. At no point did Monday ask if Sharon and Candy wanted a deaf child. Why didn't they adopt one? There are 33 children born every day in this country who are hearing impaired. That's over 12,000 kids a year. There are plenty of deaf children who need to be adopted. If the issue for Sharon and Candy was truly about wanting to share their life with a child like them, adoption would have been the decent answer. Instead, they plan to create a disabled child. And how are you supposed to view this decision? Are you supposed to accept it and respect Sharon and Candy? Monday presents them as stylish and independent college graduates and mental health professionals. That's nice. We've now been told that they know what they're doing and that they're beyond reproach. So she kind of gets back here to what the point I was trying to make. That again, if disabilities were a value, then we would cripple our children. And she's making, in an indirect way, the same kind of point. Next section, the no moral. For Lisa Monday, the moral is that there is no moral. It's all relative. In the body of the article, she admonishes us. In trying to know how to think about Sharon and Candy's endeavor, there are any number of opinions a person might have, any number of abstract ideas a person might work through in, say, an ethics course. Are the women being selfish? Are they inflicting too much hardship on the child? Well, at least she addresses the issue of selfishness, because it's obvious that that's what they're doing. Even if they had said, well, we want to get a child that's a brunette or a blonde or a boy or a girl, they're still being selfish. Okay, the idea is you want a child, and even childbearing itself has a certain selfish quality to it, but they're taking it to an illogical extreme. Back to the book. In 1987, for her role in Children of a Lesser God, actor Marlee Matlin became the first, and so far the only, deaf person to win an Oscar. The 36-year-old mother of three was asked what she thought about the situation with the lesbian couple. She reportedly shook her head in open-mouthed shock. My personal opinion, Matlin said, is that I think it's probably important for God to make that decision as opposed to us. Miss Matlin did not need to go through an ethics course to come to that conclusion. Also, speaking of ethics, the root of this is the denial of reality. Okay, you cannot come to the conclusion that being deaf is a cultural issue, and cannot come to the conclusion that being deaf is a value unless you have first suspended reality and along with it then suspended certainty of knowledge. With those two things out of the way, then you're free to create a relative ethics. Okay, and that's one of the things that needs to be hammered home here, is that the reason that we don't value disabilities is because of reality. The reality is that, again, like I said, we're all looking, the purpose of our lives is to pursue happiness, and that the best way to pursue happiness is as whole and healthy people. And that crippling oneself or crippling somebody else is not an advantage towards achieving happiness. It's a disadvantage. It sets you back in terms of having to pursue happiness, and is therefore a disvalue. And we know that with certainty. So back to the book. I hope these things seem as obvious to you as they do to me. The basics of right and wrong are easy to grasp and come naturally, but our cultural elite have other ideas. They do not want you to feel comfortable about your values. They want you to question whether or not your values are even relevant in today's multicultural society. They want you to believe that the world of two deaf lesbians is so foreign to you that their decision to inflict a disability on a child is beyond the realm of your judgment. And inflicting, they're basically hoping. They're not inflicting yet. Inflicting would be give birth to a child that can hear and then make them deaf. Okay, which is, I suppose, is the next step. Somebody's going to want to do that and then claim it's their perfect right, because after all, if reality doesn't exist and we don't have any certainty of knowledge, who is to say that a couple that deliberately makes their children deaf is wrong? Who's to say so? So again, you got to get all the way down. Ayn Rand recognized that if you're going to defeat the left and all the crap of the left, you got to be prepared to go all the way down to metaphysics, all the way down to reality when you're making your argument. And part of the problem with this book that Tammy's written is that the ethics, right and wrong, floats. And by that I mean she doesn't attach it to knowledge and attach knowledge to reality, because everything is foundational. Without reality, nothing else exists. We don't have any issues of ethics. We don't have nothing. Okay? And if we have reality, then there's the possibility of having certainty of knowledge. Without having reality, there is no possibility for certainty of knowledge. Okay? And if there's no possibility for certainty of knowledge, then there are no universal rights and wrongs. So that's where this book could have been better, is to ground it and come out and explain to people the reason that this X is right or X is wrong is because of what we know about reality. Okay, we can have arguments about it. We can have arguments about whether or not I'm describing reality correctly. We can have arguments about whether I know what I'm talking about, knowing reality correctly, whether I know what I'm talking about in essence, and therefore have an argument about whether or not what they're doing is, have an argument in general about right and wrong, about what I'm pointing out as being right or wrong. But what we cannot do is say it doesn't exist. Anyone that tries to say that it doesn't is not expressing a legitimate point of view. Anyone that says reality doesn't exist is simply a liar. And we know that by their behavior, by how they operate, by the fact that they look both ways before they cross the street. They know how to get to work on time. They know how to dress appropriately and act appropriately once they get there, etc., etc. The fact that the ladies are using a sperm donation center. If they don't believe in reality, why not just snap your fingers and expect a deaf baby to just appear magically out of nowhere? So anyone that's going to tell you that reality doesn't exist is just simply a liar. You don't even argue with them. It's just, no, I'm sorry, you're a liar. And that's what the couple is doing. And more importantly, the reporter that's reporting about these couple is lying. Back to the book. And Galvan, what has happened to the baby boy whose mother and her lesbian lover hoped he would be disabled? He failed his initial hearing screenings and appears to be quite deaf. Sharon and Candy from the self-obsessed Looking Glass world consider that to be very good news indeed. And so they're liars. They don't consider it to be very good news. Again, if they're lying about reality, then they're lying about certainty of knowledge. If they're lying about reality and certainty of knowledge, then they're lying about universal rights and wrongs. Okay, in proclaiming that, and actually what they're doing is lying more by omission than commission, because really what they're doing is skirting the issue, rather than coming out, because the couple doesn't come out and say, this is right, what we're doing. What we're doing is right in trying to raise a deaf child. They don't say that. They say they're happy. They say this. That's another reason you can tell that this is selfish. This is absolutely selfish. It has nothing to do with what's good for the child or what's good for the society, because they don't claim to be right. They don't claim that what they're doing is right. They claim that what they're doing, it makes them happy. Big difference. Next section, a view from the front lines. We Americans have a great capacity to hear the truth. This becomes particularly important when those who are driving our culture do not have our best interests at heart. Freedom of expression and personal liberty are indeed foundational principles of our life, but these principles rely on our character to maintain their value. No, again, this is where she misses the point, and the reason she does, again, is because the book is not grounded in epistemology and metaphysics. Okay, the fact of the matter is that there are foundational principles, but they rely on, ultimately, reality to maintain their value, to have any value at all. Back to the book. I've seen firsthand how the agendas of feminism, black power, multiculturalism, and gay advocacy have been consciously used to break down morals and values that the activists saw as obstructions to their achieving, first, cultural acceptance, and ultimately, cultural domination. I observed worlds where alternative lifestyle really meant no limits, where sexual freedom could not be reconciled with dignity and self-respect, where feminism meant isolating and demonizing men instead of bringing them with us as partners into our independence. I know these are distortions of what is true and healthy, so do you, and yet they are at the heart of what drives the left. Yes, the things that have made this country great are under attack by a cultural elite determined to forge a different set of rules for themselves, devoid of decency, responsibility, and honor. The thought police effort to keep us from thinking about important social issues is just the first step. The left's ultimate agenda is to change the very standard by which we view our world. So none of that can happen without our cooperation. Our meaning conservatives, ersatz and real. Okay, so Tammy Bruce is providing a service here by standing up and saying something about it. It could be a little bit better, it could be stronger written, but at least she stands up and says something about this culturally. And what's important about this is because today's culture is tomorrow's politics. Okay, people become imbued with this cultural nonsense, and they will vote accordingly in the future. Okay, so it's going to affect who runs for office, and it's going to affect what kinds of legislation is proposed. It's also going to affect the kinds of decisions made by the executive branch, whether or not to write executive orders, cancel executive orders, etc. You cannot say that President Trump and President Obama have the same cultural influences or have been influenced by the same cultural norms, so to speak. It's completely different. The cultural milieu in which President Obama was raised and or placed himself, again, put him in a position to think in certain ways, have certain expectations of our society, and to act on those expectations. And President Trump has grew up in under a different set of circumstances, has different expectations, and a completely different way of expressing those expectations. Back to the book. Don't look back. I was recently asked by a radio talk show host if I thought there was one decade which was the best, and to which, if we could, we should all be transported. I knew what he meant. Much of the public opposition to the left elite comes from people like Bill Bennett, Pat Robertson, and Pat Buchanan. all thoughtful men, albeit sometimes terribly wrong, who at one point or another have identified the 50s as that time of paradise. Women were in the home, read bedroom and kitchen, men were in the workplace. What these men seem to be actually and rightly pining for is a time before political correctness, before multiculturalism, before speech codes, before the death of right and wrong. Part of what they prefer is a time when personal responsibility was not a muddled and dying concept. The other thing that I think that yes and no. She's speculating here, and I think what really goes deeper than that is what they're really pining for is Marxism. Okay, Marxism was easy to understand. Marxism didn't get into all this psychological BS. Okay, it wasn't the left trying to get into your psyche and twist your mind, to turn people into basically political robots, which is what's happened with the new left. Okay, post-Marxism. Okay, Marxism was going along, and in the 50s, that's probably the heat of it. The United States versus the Soviet Union. You had the arms race. You had the space race, where Sputnik and John Glenn, et cetera, et cetera. But Marxism was easy to understand. The idea was capitalism. Capitalists are evil and wicked, and eventually the capitalists are going to overextend themselves, put themselves into a position where the proletariat will rise up, throw off their capitalist masters, and usher in socialist paradise. In the 60s, a lot of Marxist intellectuals said, well, gee, let me see, Marx has, his theories have been around for about over 100 years. And so where's the revolution? Nobody sees a revolution. I look around and everybody looks happy. Nobody looks like they're getting ready to throw off their capitalist masters or throw off any masters for that part. Why? And so that begat what's called critical theory. Critical theory was the idea that, because before that critical theory, you couldn't criticize Marxism and consider yourself a Marxist. If you're a Marxist, you had to go the party line. Marx has established that it is the historical inevitability of his theories. So you either have to accept it and be a Marxist or reject it and be a capitalist. There's no in between. Well, in the 60s, there were people that said, well, we think there is an in-between. And we say it's critical theory, that we can criticize Marxism and improve it, change it and improve it, and then get the revolution and the results of that revolution that we're all looking for. And that was what was then called post-Marxism. And the big change was, instead of the proletariat, instead of the workers, the revolution was heavily dependent with Marxism on the workers, the working class. They were the ones that are going to basically start the revolution. In the 60s, post-Marxism says, nah, not necessarily. Could be any oppressed class. And started coming up with oppressed classes, women, blacks, Mexicans, any type of a minority group for that matter. Not just workers. And now, lately, even Muslims. Muslims are considered today by the left as an oppressed class, and considered by the left as their best hope and shot for worldwide revolution that they think they can steer to a secular and socialist conclusion. Okay, so that's basically what all these guys, Pat Robertson, etc., are pining for. It's not so much to keep women in the, the whole idea of keeping women in the house and all that, it's all overrated. There were plenty of women in the workplace. There's women teachers and women in all kinds of different walks of life. In the 1930s, there was a woman named Madame Curie that made great discoveries in chemistry or physics. And you had Amelia Earhart, and on and on and on. There have been women, queens, heads of state, that go back centuries. So there's been women in doing things other than cleaning the house and having babies for centuries. Okay, the whole idea it's a myth. This myth of the oppressed woman, that she's oppressed, and it was Betty Friedan that first started this with a book called The Feminine Mystique. Okay, and it's just a myth. There's not men that want to, we're not a class. We don't have meetings every Thursday in a bowling alley somewhere and say, gee, how can we oppress all the minorities? How can we get women to be barefoot and pregnant again? Doesn't work like that. Okay? Never worked like that. So the real thing that Pat Robertson and whatnot, if they're opining and looking or pining for the 50s, it's because it was simpler. There wasn't all this psychological mumbo jumbo. It was an easy thing to understand, recognize, and deal with. Marxism versus capitalism. That's what they're looking for. What these, back to the book, what these men seem to be actually and rightly pining for is a time before political, I already covered that, okay. I'll tell you what I told the talk show host. We have a duty to be more creative than longing for the past. I believe the best accomplishments of the gay, feminist, and black civil rights movements in the second half of the 20th century can live alongside the moral clarity that has made America the shining city on a hill. These are not mutually exclusive concepts. We do not have to choose one or the other. Our responsibility to ourselves and to future generations is to take the best of what we become and bring it together. We've had enough of the fundamentalist arguments from both ends of the political spectrum. While religious fundamentalists fantasize about a return to the days of Ozzie and Harriet, left-wing fundamentalists are working to create a future reflective of MTV's Ozzie and Sharon. Neither option is acceptable. We know we can do better. And really the question is, and as she's kind of beating around the bush here, not quite getting to, is the issue is right and wrong. What have we changed over the past 40, 50 years, let's say from the 50s? What have we changed in the 60s? And were those changes correct? Okay. And let's look at civil rights movement, particularly as it applies to blacks, applies to voting and getting rid of Jim Crow. Were those the right things to do? Absolutely. And again, as a conservative, conservatives make the presumption for the status quo. And we change when there is an obvious prima facie case for change. Was Jim Crow a prima facie case for change? Yes. Just like slavery was. Slavery, Jim Crow. Today it would be public employee unions. And there's a few others, but we'll just leave it at that for the time being. Any obvious case for change. So when we went and made the change to be more inclusive of blacks in our society, when we said, we recognize that it is wrong to have black drinking fountains and that kind of situation, to have Jim Crow. It's wrong to have Jim Crow. We recognize that, and we corrected the mistake. That's not a right-wing thing. It's not a left-wing thing. It is the right thing. That's the point. Okay? You got to remember that conservatism transcends politics. Conservatism is about ultimately being realistic. And when you look at our society from the standpoint of Jim Crow, and Jim Crow was not realistic. It had to go. And it did. But that's the way you look at the changes we've made, whether it was giving women the vote, whether it is giving black people a vote, and making other Jim Crow changes and other changes in our society. The question is it right? And really the question then becomes, how do we know it's right? Part of it is because of, are we... the democracy and our republic even says that all men are created equal, and men we mean including women, men as in human. All humans are created equal, and so are there people in our society, humans, that are not being treated equal? Okay, and if they are, then we need to get rid of whatever barrier we have that's preventing that. Okay, and that's so to the degree that we do that is a degree to which we are living up to our standards, and the degree to which we are being realistic. Back to the book. Ironically, it was moral clarity that brought about the success of the civil rights movement in the 1960s. And now, according to William Safire, the ringing phrase moral clarity has a clearly conservative political coloration and is snubbed by many liberals as some freakish concern of the dreaded right. I submit that moral clarity does not belong to just one side or the other of the political spectrum. The fact that it seems to reside on only one side tells us something. It has been abandoned by the other, stigmatized and abandoned by the left elite, abandoned because of moral relativism. This can be remedied, after all. The political left owned moral righteousness during the struggle for civil rights. The fall came when a few of the cynical and self-obsessed decided that morality was too burdensome and that the world would be much more fun without rules. But without rules, there's no perspective, no right and wrong, only relativism, and a culture of self-gratification where everyone loses, especially a generation that must inherit our folly. Problem here with the way she's analyzing this is she is assuming that we can actually live our lives and have a society that is devoid of right and wrong. It's impossible. Reality is. Existence exists. Okay, existence is primary, consciousness is secondary. And so because of that, we will live by right and wrong. The question will become, what is right and wrong? Okay, we can make our the question of right and wrong realistic, or we can make the issue of right and wrong idealistic. And that's the issue with the left. The left is idealistic. It looks for a perfect society. Conservatives are not looking for a perfect society. Conservatives are looking to be realistic. Another thing, as I've said before, you have politicians today that when they see problems, instead of making a realistic assessment of the problem and a realistic assessment of what's possible in terms of correcting the problem, they go idealistic. They try to eliminate it. They suggest that it is possible to get rid of the problem entirely. The example I'm thinking about is Project Zero by the Los Angeles mayor. Los Angeles mayor wants to have zero traffic deaths for pedestrians. That there's a certain number of pedestrians that are killed every year by motorists. A lot of these happen to be pedestrians that are drunk, walking across an unmarked street in the dark, etc. And his vision is what he calls Vision Zero. That's what it's called, not Project. Vision Zero. He wants no fatalities. He wants perfection. Decades ago, no politician would have ever done that. They would say, we want and can expect a certain percentage reduction in the number of traffic deaths. That's realistic. But so many on the left have abandoned reality. And in part, in her analysis, I think is also flawed in terms of that the left has abandoned reality because they have the belief that the reason we have gotten the changes we've gotten is because the left has abandoned reality, abandoned knowledge, abandoned right and wrong. And they think they are going beyond right and wrong. That to get the civil rights movement, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, etc., that they had to go beyond what was right and wrong. Their argument is that that it was considered right to discriminate against blacks in all kinds of different ways. Employment, again, in terms of where they could sit on a bus, what kind of drinking fountain that they could use, how you addressed a black person, particularly a black man. You didn't call him Mr. Smith, you would call him by his first name, or call him boy. And they would say that was considered right. And so therefore, if we stick to right and wrong, we'll never get beyond, we will never make progress. And the only way we can make progress is by taking right and wrong, throwing it out the window, and going and asking ourselves, what is it we want? What are our ideals? What is our vision for a perfect country? But that's where they're wrong. It is precisely because of right and wrong that we changed. We recognized, we knew at first, we could say, and it was not even the whole society, it was only part of our society that considered Jim Crow right, but a large part of our society was into discriminating against black people in various more subtle ways. May not, in Pasadena, California, you may not have had black and white drinking fountains, but you had black and white sides of town. When I was growing up, all the blacks lived on the northwest side. Everybody else lived on the other side of town. And it was basically, the city was black and white. There were almost no Asians, no Hispanics. It was just basically black and white. And all the blacks lived on one side of town, all the whites lived on the other. And so anyways, that could be considered right. But we recognized that it was wrong. We didn't go beyond ethics. We used ethics to correct our mistakes. It's like the flat earth. We knew the earth was flat, and we had reason to know that. We looked at the horizon and said, guess what? It's flat. Then we started looking at other evidence, the way that ships behaved as we see them come in over the horizon, that indicated to us that we were wrong. So we replaced one form of knowledge with another. We were certain that the earth was flat until we became certain that we were wrong and certain that the earth was spherical. Same thing goes for the civil rights movement. We knew we were right about how we treat blacks and other racial minorities in this country until we knew that we were wrong, and we knew to change to a different way. Quit discriminating, quit using certain types of terminology, and open our eyes and our heart and be more accepting. So, back to the book. Although one may not embrace the institutional structure of organized religion, the Judeo-Christian ethic and the personal standards it encourages do not impinge on the quality of life, but enhance it. They also give one a basic moral template that is not relative, and that's exactly why it so threatens the left elite. This basic ethical guide provides standards that people like Bill Clinton, Jesse Jackson, Andrea Yates, and Mumia Abu-Jamal do not meet. But these are the very people who are held up as examples by the media elite, serving as foot soldiers for the left. And why they're held up, I have already explained. I will explain more detail in the next chapter how I came to appreciate the specificity of virtue, but there is one experience that I had that was astonishingly simple and yet played a large part in my own transition. So long as I was part of the left elite, I traveled in a pretty narrow circle. The feminist ghetto does not allow for a great deal of mixing, and certainly the enemy was never welcomed. Through my work as a radio talk show host, however, I finally began to meet and talk with people who impressed me, were thoughtful, and were religiously devout. My experience contradicted everything I'd been taught. The religious, Christians specifically, were supposedly the enemy, but the people I was now meeting were nothing like the rabid, intolerant species I had been told they were. In fact, unlike my leftist colleagues, they displayed respect for others, tolerance, and thoughtfulness, all the while remaining true to their own beliefs and principles. These are values I feel are inherent in true feminism, and yet were absent from the world to which I had devoted myself. I was moved and changed by the experience. It made me realize that perhaps there was more for me to consider when it came to the quality and meaning of life. Something had to explain why my left elite allies were generally miserable, angry, and paranoid. You could put me on that list at the time as well. While the enemy was secure, comfortable, and a group of generally happy and determined people. Funnily enough, at that time, values and virtue didn't even occur to me as the missing pieces of the puzzle. These ideas, along with religion itself, had become so demonized that I had stopped even thinking about them conceptually. My adventure outside the feminist ghetto was initially born of curiosity, but it became much more than that. I learned the truth about people, something I was never afforded as a member of the left elite. Next section, a community of the decent. Knowing what's right and how to respond to what's wrong is usually not that difficult. I'm not talking about some of the more complicated issues of our day where thoughtful people have come to seriously different ethical conclusions. The issues I'll be presenting to you are morally plain and clear, not just to the devout, but to the decent. That's most of us. The attempt to change that balance can be seen in everything from the lauding of moral terrorists like Eminem to approving stories about the morally bankrupt in the respected newspaper of our nation's capital, to the praise of assaults on right and wrong presented as art or higher learning. Make no mistake, nothing is just entertainment. All these fronts are meant to shape the cultural debate and to change, not for the better, our view of the world. That's important. See, again, here's a situation right here where she hits the nail right on the head. Bingo, home run. I'm sure there are a multitude of moments when you have an immediate values-based reaction to something in the news, and were surprised and disappointed when the public debate took a different turn. Perhaps you even wondered if you were out of touch. Well, it comes to someone like our performance artist, Jonathan Yegi, and what he has to offer, being out of touch is just fine. It is time to trust your instincts and not be swayed by the cultural elite arguments, classifying judgment, decency, and morality as irrelevant, passé, or even harmful. Ultimately, we are engaged in a war to determine the future of virtue. The failure of culture does not happen on a battlefield. Sometimes a great civilization collapses from within, but we don't have to let that happen. We can be a crew that has decided to survive and even win. Information is key to this effort. So let's begin. And again, the only thing that she's missing there is the idea that right and wrong is never going to go away because it's a fundamental part of reality. Reality is we're all looking for the same thing. We want to be happy. And morality is about that. It's like a roadmap. How can I be happy? And a lot of it is based on other people's experiences. People will tell you, don't do this, do that. Why? Because in a lot of cases, these people have been there. They've tried this, it didn't work, and they found out, aha, that's not the way to do things. That is the way to do things. Okay, so you can waste time, which is part of what the left actually wants you to do, okay, because they say they want you to learn by hitting every pothole in the road every single day. Because their attitude is reality doesn't exist. That means if you hit a pothole today, doesn't mean it'll be there tomorrow. So you got to go and hit it again. Oh, pothole is still there. 1 + 1 = 2 today. But tomorrow, who knows? So you got to check it again. So you have to, again, there is no learning taking place. You're just going over the same things over. It's like Groundhog Day, the movie Groundhog Day, where you're doing the same things over and over and over and over again, except without actually learning anything or doing anything different. So next time that we pick this up, it's going to be Chapter 2, The Left's Inquisition. And there's a quote here, where there is no God, all is permitted. And so that brings us to the conclusion of another episode of The Drill. I thank you for listening, and until next time, have a great day.